fucking arsehole! Out of the corner of my eye, through a pinkish mist, I could see Julia, her mouth open with shock. You're a jealous, snobbish, has-been loser, I spat. Max sneered. Jealous? Of the tripe you churn out? You're not even a proper writer. You're just a hack. No one will read your books in 5 years, but mine will live on long after I'm gone. The mist was dark red now. After you're gone? I jabbed a finger at him. That might be sooner than you think, you fucking... Lucas! It was Julia. She had hold of both my arms now, and held me still like I was a child. Calm down, I heard Susie say. Has he been drinking? I hadn't heard her enter the room. Come on, Julia said. Let's find you something to eat. I shook my head. I'm not hungry. I'm going up to my room. I could feel them all watching me as I headed up. The walls swam around my head. The stairs felt like they were made of foam. I fell onto the bed fully dressed and blacked out immediately. When I came to, it felt as if I'd been sucking cotton wool. It was still dark, but I was surprised to find it was only midnight. I'd been asleep for 4 hours. Now my body clock was going to be really screwed up. I staggered to the bathroom and drank water from the tap, then splashed some on my face and cleaned my teeth. I could hear voices downstairs. The others were still up. A memory of my argument with Max hit me and I recoiled. Had I really gloated about being a bestseller? Oh, God, what a dickish thing to do. I splashed some more water on my face until I was fully awake. Going down the stairs, I could hear Ursula, her voice echoing through the house. I didn't know who she was talking to. Suddenly, Julia appeared at the bottom of the staircase. She stopped dead when she saw me. Can I talk to you? I said, when I reached her. In private? She looked left and right, then said, Follow me. To my surprise, she unlocked the door to the basement. I thought guests weren't allowed down here, that it wasn't safe. A little smile. That's not strictly true about it being unsafe. I just wanted to keep this space to myself. Now, I'm making an exception, just this once. I followed her down. I expected to find a dusty room full of cobwebs and junk, old boxes and cracked walls. I thought perhaps there would be a broken stair or exposed wires, something to explain why no one was supposed to come down here. I couldn't believe what I saw as Julia flicked a switch and a fluorescent strip light juddered to life. Welcome to the playroom, she said. It was a child's paradise. Beanbags and scatter cushions were heaped on the floor, and there was a comfortable old sofa, in front of which stood a TV and a games console. The walls were brightly coloured, with posters everywhere containing positive messages. Dream big. What if I fall? Oh, my darling, but what if you fly? There was a huge doll's house and heaps of cuddly toys and board games, colouring books and pens and art equipment, a chalkboard and a dressing-up box overflowing with costumes. Wow! She sat on the sofa, sinking into it. This was Lily's favourite room, even more than her bedroom. It's amazing. My God, I wish I'd had something like this when I was a kid. Julia picked up a stuffed rabbit and stroked its ears. That's why we created it. We wanted Lily to have all the things we didn't. Her den, her private space. She used to come down here with Megan, or sometimes she'd bring Chesney down here and play with him. And the plan was, if we had another child... She trailed off, deep in memory for a few seconds. I like coming down here. It doesn't make me feel sad, like her bedroom. Sometimes I sit here for hours and think, and it makes me feel peaceful. I know that might sound strange, but... She shrugged. Now, what did you want to talk to me about? I took a deep breath. I don't know how you're going to react. Try me. Okay. Do you remember telling me you wished you could afford to hire a private investigator? Well, I told her everything, starting with hiring Zara. I told her how Zara was confident the police had done all they could. I recounted her meeting with Malcolm at the chess club and our subsequent conversation at the pub. And then she vanished, I said, going on to tell her what had happened today. Along the way, I told her about Glyn Collins and the Historical Society and all the other fragments of information I'd uncovered but failed to piece together. I told her how my mum had told me about another girl going missing 37 years ago, which Julia knew already. Several people mentioned that to me when Lily vanished, as if it would make me feel better. I finished by telling her about what I'd found at the bed and breakfast. Shirley, dead. That's why I was so shaken when I got home. She raised an eyebrow at my use of the word home. But apart from that, she seemed calm, apparently accepting what I was saying. She didn't shout or get angry or act horrified. She listened and absorbed what I had to say, her legs tucked underneath her. A strand of hair kept falling over her left eye. She brushed it away, keeping her gaze focused on me throughout. When I'd finished, she untucked her legs and sat forward. I knew I should have thrown you out when I found out what you write. It hadn't been calm acceptance. It was stunned disbelief. Julia, shut up. She got to her feet. I went to rise too, but she reached forward and pushed me back onto the sofa. She stood over me. How could you? She yelled. How could you hire someone? Get them to poke into my business? How? She wanted to say more, but was choked by anger. I didn't want to get your hopes up, I said. Jesus Christ. Not unless I found something. Julia, you said you wished you could afford a detective. I was doing it for you. A favour. She had stalked off, a few feet away from me. Really? Are you sure you were doing it for me? I needed to defend myself. If I sat there and tried to apologise, she would chuck me out, I was sure of it. I stood up. Yes, Julia, I was doing it for you, for Lily. I wanted to check the police had done all they could. I saw how distraught you were and wanted to help you. The damsel in distress. Your gender has nothing to do with it. Huh, I bet. I shook my head. It doesn't, actually. But I didn't sound very sure, even to myself. If it had been Julia who'd drowned, would I have tried to help Michael in the same way? I wanted to believe that I would, but maybe I shouldn't have done it. Like I said, I was only going to tell you if I got anywhere, and I think I have. I've stirred something up, and I'm certain it's related to Lily. She stared at me, chest rising and falling. But you haven't really got anywhere, have you? It's like a conspiracy theory, a crazy conspiracy theory. You might as well have told me aliens came down and took Lily off in a spaceship. I know how it sounds, Julia, but Glyn Collins, don't you think it's a massive coincidence that within a couple of weeks of my private detective starting to ask questions, 2 members of that group are dead, and the detective herself is missing? On holiday. And the other 2 deaths, it's not coincidence, it's a chain, cause and effect. The visit from Zara caused Malcolm stress and made him have a heart attack. Then, what's her name, Shirley, died after getting drunk at his funeral. But why was Malcolm stressed? I don't know. Maybe he did know something about this girl who vanished in the 80s. Maybe Malcolm Jones was a paedophile, but that has nothing to do with Lily. I thought about it. I'd been so focused on Glyn that it hadn't crossed my mind that Malcolm might be guilty of anything more than not exposing Glyn's crimes. Could Julia be right? Was Malcolm the bad guy here? But what if Malcolm was still operating 2 years ago? With a 35-year gap between crimes? I stood up, paced the room. At least Julia was engaging with me now and not marching me up the stairs and telling me to pack my bags. There could be others we don't know about, I said. Other missing children. Maybe it was Malcolm, or Glyn, or... The lights went out, and above our heads, in the belly of the house, a woman screamed. Chapter 29. Lily, 2014. Mum stuck her head around Lily's bedroom door. Megan's coming over. She'll be here in 15 minutes, so you should get dressed and brush your hair. What? Why? It was Saturday morning, and Lily was on her bed, still in her PJs, playing a game on her iPad. Megan's mum's been calling to work, and her stepdad's away on a stag weekend. Jake is coming too. Lily made the groaning, "oh" sound her mum hated so much. Just get dressed, okay, and be nice to Jake. He's a lovely boy. 15 minutes later, tyres crunched on the gravel outside. Lily looked out of her window. Megan and Jake were getting out of a taxi along with the taxi driver who escorted them to the front door. The bell rang. By the time Lily got downstairs, Megan and Jake were standing in the hall and Mum was talking to the taxi man. It sounded like he was a neighbour and old friend of Megan's mum's, and he wasn't supposed to be working today, but he'd run the kids over as a favour. He had nothing else to do. He winked at Lily over her mum's shoulder. Why don't you
come in for a cup of tea, Ollie. Yeah, thanks. That'd be great. Follow me. Lily, why don't you take Megan and Jake down to the playroom? I'll bring you down some drinks and snacks in a bit. OK. Lily hesitated. Where's Dad? Mum's eyes shifted around in that way they did when she wasn't sure what to say. He's, having a lie-in. Lucky bloke, said Ollie. Isn't he just? She sounded angry, though she was trying to hide it behind the smile she always wore when they had visitors. Mum and the taxi driver went off to the kitchen, and Lily ran down the stairs to the playroom, Megan at her heels, Jake trailing behind. Megan turned around. Hurry up, slow coach. Sorry, Meg. He almost bumped his head on the low ceiling halfway down the stairs. He was growing a moustache. Bum fluff, Megan called it. She rolled her eyes, and Lily, not for the first time, felt sorry for him. Although she often wished she had a brother or sister, she'd hate to be bossed around in the way Megan bossed Jake. Megan headed straight for the Wii U. Want a game of Mario Kart? Bet I can beat you this time. Last time Megan had come here, she'd moaned that Lily didn't have that bloody Mary game. Luckily, it wasn't available for the Wii U, so Lily had a good excuse. As Megan set up the game, Lily turned her head to see what Jake was doing. He was staring at the art supplies. Lily remembered that he was really good at drawing and asked him if he wanted some paper and pens. Thanks, Lily. He settled down on a beanbag with a pad and a pack of colouring pens. Megan looked over her shoulder. Hey, Jake, it's Mum's birthday next week. Make her a card from both of us. Yes, Meg. Lily and Megan played Mario Kart. Megan won the first race, thanks to a massively fluky blue shell right at the end, and Lily beat her in the second and third. They were about to start race 4 when the door at the top of the stairs opened. All right, guys. It was the taxi driver, carrying a tray with smoothies and cartons and a plate of chocolate chip cookies. Yay, snacks! Megan paused the game. Thanks, Ollie. He said to Lily, Your mum asked me to bring these down. She had to take a phone call. Oh, right, thanks. He looked around. Oh, this is a pretty cool space. What are you playing? Oh, I love that game. Who's your favourite character? I always play as Bowser. He's heavy, but when he gets going, whoosh! He laughed. Lily stared at him. Was he like Jake? A little kid, trapped in a big body? I haven't been to this house for years. My dad had a friend who lived here. Hey, you might have met my dad. He's the town librarian. Lily looked at him blankly. She'd never been to Bedmawr Library. Why would she need to, when her house was full of books, most of them awesomely boring? Lily liked the books Mum had illustrated, partly because they were all dedicated to her. Ollie crouched down next to Jake. What are you drawing, mate? Jake, who'd finished the birthday card and moved on to something else, showed him the paper. Whoa! What's this? Lily peered over Ollie's shoulder. The paper was covered in drawings of bare, spiky trees. At the centre of the drawing was a dark figure with arms and legs like wobbly spaghetti, a long body, and a fat head with cat's eyes. Jake had pressed so hard with the pen while drawing this figure, he'd almost gone through the paper. It's the widow, Jake said, in a hushed voice. Lily expected Ollie to laugh, but he didn't. His voice was as serious as Jake's when he replied, The Red Widow, eh? My dad told me about her. He repeated all the stuff Lily already knew. Even Megan appeared a little bored of the topic, but Jake gawped at Ollie as if it was the first time he'd heard it. Ollie looked sidelong at the girls. I saw her once, he said. That grabbed their attention. You didn't, Megan said. I did, actually, when I was about your age. It was just before that little girl disappeared, Caris. Lily stared at him, as did Megan and Jake. He settled down on a beanbag. I was in the woods, near here, with my friends, building a camp. Parents weren't so paranoid about letting kids out to play on their own in those days. Anyway, we'd built the camp, and then one of my friends announced that he needed a loo, a number 2. Megan giggled. Yeah, gross, huh? He went off to do what bears do in the woods, and a minute later he came running back, shouting and screaming, saying someone was chasing him, a woman. And that's when I saw her, between the trees. She had eyes, just like that. He tapped the drawing, and they glowed white, like she was blind. I got the impression she was sniffing the air, that she could smell us, thinking we smelled sweet. Megan grabbed Lily's hand and squeezed it. Jake made a low, moaning sound. And then she pointed at us and said, "It's time." "There's no such thing," Lily reminded herself. "No such thing." "What did you do?" Megan asked. "What do you think we did? We ran like our bums were on fire." He laughed, and the children stared at him. "It's time," Megan whispered. "Yeah," Ollie said, "because the witch demands a sacrifice once every 35 years, according to the legend. When that little girl Caris vanished, that's what we all thought. The witch took her and gobbled her up." It was silent in the playroom. All Lily could hear was Jake's heavy breathing. Ollie looked at each of them in turn. "You know, that happened in 1980, he said, and Lily realised he was just like Megan's granddad. He enjoyed winding up kids, seeing if they'd believe his scary stories. "Next year it will be 35 years, and it will be time again." He looked at their gaping mouths and saucer eyes. "She's going to be looking for another child." Chapter 30. As soon as we heard the scream, Julia took out her phone and switched on the flashlight, the weak light casting her in a ghostly glow. She headed for the stairs, and I followed. I wished I hadn't left my new phone in my room. It was dark in the hallway, too. Somebody appeared in the Thomas room doorway, a black silhouette. Julia pointed the beam of her phone flashlight at the door. It was Max. "What was that scream?" Julia asked. Susie. Ursula was in the middle of telling us this really creepy story about a dark spirit. You know, the usual nonsense she comes out with. And suddenly the lights went out. It was brilliant. It was as if she'd staged it." Julia stepped into the doorway and shone her light inside. Ursula sat in an armchair, apparently frozen to the spot, holding a glass of wine. "Where's Susie now?" I asked. She disappeared. I think she was embarrassed. She's gone to her room. Do you think it's a local power cut? Does that happen a lot round here?" "Not since I've lived here," Julia replied. "It might be the fuses," I said. "It probably just needs resetting. Where's the box?" In the utility room." We left Max waiting by the Thomas room and went through the kitchen to the little room where Julia kept her washing machine and dryer. She shone the flashlight at the fuse box, which was on the wall by the back door. I opened it. "Oh, it's not the switches," I said. "It must be a power cut. Have you got any candles?" I think so. Hang on." We went back into the kitchen. If this had happened in my flat in London, we would have been fine. Priya had been obsessed with scented candles, and most of them were still around. Sometimes I lit them to remind myself of her, if I was feeling strong enough. The smell of jasmine or cinnamon would always remind me of her. But Julia wasn't into candles. The only candles I'd seen since coming here were the ones on Lily's birthday cake. She searched through the kitchen drawers. Loads of junk, but no candles. "I think they're in the cottage," she said. Max had come into the kitchen holding his phone, the flashlight switched on. "I'll go and fetch them," I said. "I'll come too," said Max. "There's no need." But he was already heading out the back door. Julia handed me the key to the cottage, and I went after him. It was cold outside and overcast, a few stars peeking through the gaps between the clouds. We only had Max's phone to illuminate the way, but as we moved towards the cottage, my eyes started to grow accustomed to the darkness, black shapes against a grey backdrop. Max stopped walking. "What are you doing?" I asked. "I actually wanted a chance to talk to you," he said. "Listen, Lucas, I swear I didn't take your pen on purpose. I actually have no recollection of picking it up, but, you know, we'd all had a drink." I could hardly see his face, but he sounded sincere, and my emotions were reverberating from the encounter with Julia. I really didn't want another argument. "It's okay," I said. "I'm sorry about earlier. I'd had a difficult day. I apologise, too, for what I said. I know it's no excuse, but I've been under a lot of stress, too. Some marital issues, which is why I'm staying here a little longer. My wife doesn't want me to go home." I nodded. "I didn't sleep with Susie, though, whatever you think. I'm guilty of many things, but not that." Again, he sounded sincere. "I'm sorry if it seemed like I was judging you." He laughed. "I hope no one overhears. They might think we're bonding. Heaven forbid. Come on, we should try to find these candles." We headed over to the cottage and I opened the door. Max led the way, going into the kitchen first. I began to look through drawers while Max held the flashlight. "The power will probably come back on the moment we find them," he said. There were no candles in the first drawer, or the second, though I found a cigarette lighter which I pocketed, thinking it would come in handy. "You know, I kind of wish I wrote horror like you," Max said. "Or ghost stories, anyway. Think of all the inspiration I'd have had since coming here. Your creative synapses must be on fire." He didn't know the half of it. I was tempted to fill him in, but then he said, "Something weird happened to me the other night." I paused halfway through searching the drawer. "What?" "Well, I got up in the middle of the night to go to the loo and heard someone singing." I waited. It was a woman. At first I thought it must be Julia, but it didn't sound like it was coming from her bedroom. It sounded like someone was inside the room with me. Was it this song? I sang a couple of lines of Ian Dow Tree. Yes, that was it. "I've heard it too," I said. "So did Karen. It was one of Lily's favourite songs, apparently." Max puffed out air. "Well, that matches what Ursula said. You don't believe in ghosts, do you? Even though you write horror?" "No, I don't." I knew we ought to head back to the house or look elsewhere in the cottage for candles, but Max seemed keen to talk. Me neither. Except... What? Talking to Ursula, it makes me wonder. Oh, don't you start. She's making it all up." He leaned against the worktop, looking out at the night. The clouds had cleared a little, revealing more stars, silvery light glimmering across the lawn, with trees and shrubbery emerging from the darkness. "She's very convincing," he said. "I told her about the singing I heard, and she said it could be Lily's ghost, trapped here in this house, unwilling to move on to the next realm because of her mother's unhappiness. Ursula's going to consult her spirit guide. She said... Hang on, what was that?" "What?" I joined him at the window. "I saw someone. Over there, on the driveway. Look." I peered into the darkness. The clouds shifted, revealing the moon. There was someone standing near the top of the driveway, facing us. It was too dark to make out their features, to even tell if it was a man or a woman, but a suspect immediately came to mind. Before I could say anything, Max dashed from the kitchen and out of the front door. He called out, "Hey!" The person moved down the driveway, away from the house. Max headed after them. I followed, catching up and falling into step beside him. The figure was running now, only just visible as a flickering shape on the horizon of my vision. "I don't think it's a power cut," Max said. "Look, there's a light on in the house over there, on the hill." He pointed towards the nearest neighbour. The person we'd seen on the driveway had stopped running. I couldn't see their face, but I was certain they were watching us, waiting to see what we did. Could it really be Glyn Collins? A knot of fear formed in my stomach. If I was right, he'd already dealt with 3 people who threatened to expose him. I hadn't even stopped to think that I was the obvious next target. In which case, I was walking straight into his trap. "Come on," Max said, and broke into a run. The shadowy figure ran too. I had no choice but to follow. There were potholes on the path, and I stumbled into one. Max grabbed my arm to stop me from falling. I glanced across at him and saw that he was grinning. He was enjoying it, like it was a game. He increased his pace, leaping over a huge puddle. I guessed this was an escape from his other worries, money, his career, marital woes. This was a little adventure. We reached the narrow lane that bisected the trees and stopped. The lane stretched left and right, and directly ahead of us was a copse. The main road was beyond that, and a little further on the river. Our quarry was no longer in sight. "Which way did they go?" Max asked. I held up a finger. "Listen." Rustling came from the copse ahead. "This way," I said, jogging into the trees where I was swallowed by darkness. The ground beneath my feet was mulchy, slippery, and I grabbed a skinny tree for support. I waited for Max to catch up, as he was carrying our only source of light. He stopped beside me and swung the phone left and right, light bouncing between the trees like a will-o'-the-wisp. Tentatively, we pushed through the branches, Max swearing as something scratched his face. He lowered the flashlight, and I hurried blindly on, the lizard part of my brain screaming at me to get out of these trees, even if greater danger lay further ahead. I was sweating, and my heart was beating faster than ever before. I crashed through the final line of trees and stumbled, my knees hitting the rough tarmac. Max pulled me to my feet. "You all right?" I was too high on adrenaline to feel pain. I heard a twig snap ahead of us. "I think he's heading to the river." Max nodded once and strode into the final thicket of trees, their branches still bare from winter. I took a deep breath and joined him, pushing through until we emerged on the path that ran alongside the river. "This is where Julia's husband drowned," I said in a hushed voice. "The exact spot." The water swept around the bend, sucking in starlight and snuffing it out. A curtain of mist hung over the far bank, casting the trees on that side as shadow play. Max looked around while I stared at the water, then hissed, "There!" Max dashed off to the left, vanishing into the copse. I did the same, pushing through into a clearing between a circle of trees. I strained to locate the light from Max's phone. There it was, to the right, dancing among the branches. I drew in a breath, afraid to speak. I heard Max say, "Show yourself." A pause, then, "What are you doing?" It seemed he'd come face to face with the person we'd been pursuing. There was a scuffling sound, the crunch of twigs breaking and cracking, a grunt, and the sound of something heavy hitting the ground. The spot of light from Max's phone disappeared. "Max?" I was frozen to the spot. I muttered to myself, Come on, move." And managing to unstick my feet, I started towards the place in the trees where Max had been standing, pulling aside a pair of saplings that guarded the spot. And then, noise behind me, footsteps on wet leaves. I started to turn. An explosion of pain in my head. I fell, blind, hit the earth. Darkness. Chapter 31. I awoke in a world of pain and cold. My eyes opened, but I was blind. My lungs tried to suck in air, and my body flooded. My arms flailed, but there was nothing to hold. Maybe it only took a second for my brain to make sense of where I was, what was happening, but it felt like much longer. An eternity of confusion. By the time I figured it out, my palms felt solid ground beneath them. The riverbed. I was in the water. The pain in my head was indescribable, like hot knives in grey matter. Inside my head, a wave of blackness tried to drag me under, my brain wanting to shut my body down, but a shred of survival instinct fought against it. I was drowning. Somehow, I marshalled the forces of my body, pushing against the riverbed and kicking upwards, flailing in the black, freezing water, feeling it dragging me back down like a creature. "Sweetmeat, come to me, my sweetmeat," had hold of my ankles. I screamed an inaudible scream, kicked and pulled, fought to escape this liquid grave. "Give in," said a voice inside me. "Let go. Accept it. Sink into nothingness. No more pain. No more suffering. Let me make you better, my sweet meat." No, I refused to let go. I refused to die. With the last of my strength, I pushed upwards, towards the stars that shone high above the surface and called to me, told me to keep going, to not give up. I burst through, snapped at the air, fought the desperate screaming pain in my skull and kicked towards the bank. I grabbed at weeds that tore away in my hands. To the left, I saw the flat stones on which Julia had stood, unable to save her husband. I dragged myself towards them, finally crawling from the water. Gasping and shivering, I lay on my back on the stones, eyes shut, blackness rushing over me again. I surrendered to it. "Lucas! Lucas!" I didn't wake suddenly this time. Darkness slowly retreated. Someone was saying my name. A warm hand touched my face, and something was laid over me. "Lucas, it's me, Julia." My eyes opened, and I saw her looking down at me. I tried to speak, but my teeth were chattering too much. She held my hand, squeezed it. Above her head, the stars, that had saved me. I realized she'd covered my soaking wet body with her coat. I tried to push myself up, but a lightning bolt of pain flashed through my skull. I gasped, and a look of concern flitted across Julia's face. "I came looking for you," she said, "when you didn't come back from the cottage. What happened? Why were you in the water?" I tried to speak again, but coughed instead, river water running from my mouth. Julia knelt beside me, gently turning me onto my side so I didn't choke. She repositioned the coat. "I've called an ambulance," she said. I coughed and spluttered again, more water spilling from my lungs. I was trembling all over and didn't think I would ever feel warm again. But I needed to speak, to ask her something. "Max," I managed to say. "Where is he?" Once again, before she could answer, I blacked out. I woke up in hospital. The pain in my head had subsided. They must have pumped me full of painkillers. I tested my arms and legs, fingers and toes. Everything seemed to work. I was still nauseous, shaky, cold, but I pushed myself into a sitting position, careful not to disturb the tube that ran from a drip into my arm. I gingerly felt the back of my head, which was covered with a bandage. Morning light streamed through the window. A nurse spotted me and headed over. "Mr. Radcliffe, you need to take it easy." She had an Eastern European accent and kind eyes. "Is Julia here?" I asked. "Is that the woman who found you? She's nearby, don't worry. The doctor's going to want to take a look at you. I'll let him know you're awake." She was about to go when I said, "Wait, Max Lake? Is he here?" I strained to look around the ward, but couldn't see him. She attempted a reassuring smile, which didn't quite come off. "I think the police want to talk to you as soon as the doctor says it's okay." She hurried away. The doctor came, gave me the once-over and told me I was fine. They were going to keep me in for a little while for observation. They were mostly concerned about my head injury. "It's not as bad as it must have felt," the doctor said. "Your skull isn't fractured. We've already carried out an X-ray and scan, and there doesn't appear to be any internal damage. You have a tough head, Mr. Radcliffe, but we want to monitor you for concussion and so on. There's a risk of a subdural hematoma developing, but I think you're going to be okay." "What was I hit with?" I asked. He consulted his notes. "A rock, I think. But the police will be able to tell you more." "What about Max Lake? Is he here?" The doctor frowned. "Not that I'm aware of." Half an hour later, I was lying with my eyes closed, replaying what had happened, when I heard someone say my name. I opened my eyes to see a woman with short dark hair standing over me. She introduced herself as Detective Constable Carla Hawkins. "Are you feeling up to answering some questions?" she asked, pulling up a plastic chair. "Of course, but can you answer one of mine first? Max Lake, where is he? Is he okay?" She formed a fist with her hand and put it to her lips, clearing her throat. "I'm afraid Mr. Lake's body was recovered from the River Dee early this morning." Oh, Jesus. I wasn't shocked. Since waking up, I'd been steeling myself for this news. The same thing that happened to me had clearly happened to Max, except he hadn't managed to get out of the river. Had he even woken up and struggled? I hope not. Better to be oblivious than to struggle against drowning and fail. "Were you close?" DC Hawkins asked, studying me, obviously trying to read my face and body language. "No, I've only known him a couple of weeks, but..." Guilt squeezed my insides. "It's my fault. I brought this upon us, and I'm alive, and he's dead." "What do you mean, you brought this upon you? Do you know who did this?" She had a notepad ready in her lap, pencil poised. Just as I had with Julia last night. My God, what a long 24 hours it had been. I ran through the whole story, keeping it as succinct as possible. DC Hawkins interrupted every so often to ask questions. I didn't mention any of the weird goings-on at the retreat, and I tried to avoid straying into conspiracy theory territory. At the end, I said, "It's Glenn Collins. He did this." DC Hawkins tapped her pencil slowly on the pad. "Did you see him?" "No, it was too dark, but I'm sure it was him. Who else could it be?" The look she gave me was inscrutable. "Do you know him?" I asked. My head throbbed, and I winced as I spoke. Everyone says he's a pillar of the community. She shook her head. I'm based in Wrexham. One of your colleagues had a relationship with Zara Sullivan, the private detective I hired. I don't know his name, but maybe Zara spoke to him between talking to me and disappearing. We'll look into it, she said. There was a long silence. I broke it by saying, So, this is a murder investigation? Her expression was grim. We don't get many of those around here. Just missing children. She stood up. 2 in 40 years. It's hardly an epidemic. She handed me her card. We'll be in touch. If you remember anything else in the meantime, any details that can help us identify your assailant, please call me. What about protection? I asked. For me, I mean. He tried to kill me. What if he comes here to finish the job? She spread her palms to indicate that I was surrounded by people. You'll be safe here, Mr. Ratcliffe. Try not to worry. I woke up later to find Julia sitting by the bed. I brought you some snacks, she said, gesturing to a couple of bags on the bedside cabinet, and some magazines. I brought your phone, too. She handed me the phone I'd bought to replace my lost one. How are you feeling? I think I'm in shock. About Max, I mean. She brushed her hand across her forehead and sighed. She looked terribly sad. I realised the whole thing must have taken her back to the terrible events 2 years before, when she watched Michael drown in that same spot. Thank you for saving me, I said. I probably would have died of hypothermia if I'd been left there by the river. I expect you were tempted to let me. She exhaled. I understand why you did it. And I know you were trying to help. I smiled at her. I'm still angry with you. My smile faded. But I'm glad you didn't drown. I guess that was the best I was going to get. So, you didn't see anyone by the river? She asked. I repeated what I'd told D.C. Hawkins and half expected Julia to be sceptical, as she'd been earlier. But this was different, wasn't it? There was no way this could be put down to natural causes or an innocent explanation. Someone had attacked me. Someone had murdered Max. You really think Glyn knows something about Lily? She asked. Her voice was full of longing and terror. Hopefully the police will be talking to him now, I said. Have they been to your house? Did they look at what happened to the electricity? Oh, yes, they've been round. 2 of them came and interviewed Ursula and Susie and me. Looked around. They took Max's computer. Yours too. What? Sorry, I couldn't stop them. They said they needed to check it. They didn't say why. My novel was on that laptop. Although it was backed up to the cloud, I didn't have access to another computer here. Still, it hardly seemed like the most important thing at the moment. And the electricity? I asked. It came on before I got back to the house, she replied. I told the police about it, and they said they'd look into that too. They're frustratingly vague. They were like this when Lily disappeared. My headache was coming back with a vengeance now. My vision was soft around the edges, a steady pain pulsing out from the back of my skull. I needed whatever drugs the doctors were willing to give me. How are the others? Susie and Ursula? Julia shook her head. Ursula's taken to her bed. I can't get any sense out of her. Susie, well, she's really upset. She locked herself in her room after she heard about Max, but I could hear her crying. Max told me there was nothing going on between them. Did you believe him? I thought about it. Yeah, I did. God, I'm glad I managed to apologise to him before it happened. Julia shifted in her seat. Ursula told the police about your argument. Oh, great. It's been like a circus at the house. As well as the police, the media turned up. We've had photographers and video crews outside. Her face darkened. The bastards mentioned Michael and Lily on the news reports. Tragedy strikes again in Beauty Spot, all that bullshit. Apparently Max's wife is on her way too, to collect his things and see where it happened. I haven't been down to the river, but I've heard it's teeming with rubberneckers. Without warning, she grabbed my hand. I'm so... She stopped, then forced herself to continue. I'm so glad you got out of the water. Taken aback, I tried to make light of it. Me too. When I saw you lying there on the stones, I thought you were dead." To my surprise, tears filled her eyes. She continued to hold my hand, but gazed into space, into the past. I don't think I ever mourned Michael properly. I was so fixated on finding Lily. Even his funeral, I was numb, not able to grieve. I'm told I cried, but I don't remember. I hardly heard a word of the service. I squeezed her hand and waited for her to continue. "I miss him," she said. "I was so angry with him for a long time once the numbness passed. Angry for his drinking, blaming him for the argument that meant we weren't watching Lily. Our marriage hadn't been good for a long time, and we were probably going to break up. I mean, we'd been in and out of the Last Chance saloon a dozen times. He'd promised he was going to give up the booze because it was destroying us, but he didn't. And I realised that day he never would." She produced a tissue and blew her nose. 5 minutes later, he was dead. I waited for her to continue. "There was another thing, too, another woman. I never found out for sure, but I think Michael was cheating on me with this woman in his office, Lana. Maybe they were only emotionally involved, I don't know. But there was something going on. He probably would have ended up with her after we split up, and I wonder sometimes if he kept drinking because he wanted me to chuck him out. It was his passive way of ending our marriage." She blew her nose again. "He loved Lily, though. I guess she's the other reason he hung around." She wiped the tears from her cheeks and sniffed. "Oh, God, you're lying there with a massive bandage on your head after someone tried to kill you, and here I am, going on about my woes. Julia, don't be silly. It's good. You should talk about it." She shuddered. "I'm scared, Lucas. I can't even express exactly why, but I'm scared." I tried to find the right words, but before I could locate them, someone said my name. "Mr. Radcliffe?" It was D.C. Hawkins. This time she had another cop with her, a middle-aged man in an ageing suit. She introduced him as Detective Inspector Gary Snaith. He nodded at Julia. "Mrs. Marsh?" He must have met her at Nythe Bran. I wondered if he'd also been involved in the search for Lily 2 years ago. "Do you mind if we have a word with Mr. Radcliffe on his own?" he asked. She was flustered. "Yes, I mean, no, I need to get back anyway. I'll call you later, Lucas." As soon as she'd gone, D.C. Hawkins said, "We spoke to Glyn Collins. He was at home all night with his girlfriend." I pushed myself up in the bed. "Girlfriend?" D.I. Snaith smiled. "Perhaps lady friend would be a better term, but yes, seems there's life in the old dog." I wondered if this was the woman he'd been talking to at the funeral, the one with the cleavage. "Mr. Collins' lady friend is an insomniac," Snaith continued. "She was awake most of the night, with her gentleman friend lying beside her, snoring." "So, whoever attacked you," Hawkins said, "it wasn't Glyn Collins." Chapter 32. The two detectives stayed for ages, conducting what they called an informal chat. They wanted to know everything about me. Did I have any enemies? Did Max? They'd heard Max and I had a fight yesterday. Could I tell them more about that? Why did we decide to follow the person we'd seen down to the river? Had we been drinking? "Why are you asking if Max had enemies?" I said. "I told you, I was the target." "So, why kill Mr. Lake?" D.C. Hawkins asked. "I think he saw their face." As I was answering their questions, my mind whirred. If it wasn't Glyn who attacked me and killed Max, who the hell was it? Did this mean he wasn't responsible for everything else? Had I been completely wrong? "Are you sure Glyn Collins' lady friend isn't lying for him?" I asked. "You can never be 100%, Snaith responded. "But she, Margaret, is the ex-wife of one of our retired chief inspectors. He told us she's the most honest woman he's ever met, and there's no way she'd protect a criminal. Also, Mr. Collins has this app on his phone that records his sleep patterns." I nodded. Priya had used one of those.
He showed it to us. According to this app, he slept like a baby while Margaret tossed and turned beside him.
Maybe he has someone helping him, I said. Even as the words came out, I realised how desperate I sounded. The two detectives exchanged a look. D.C. Hawkins spoke. The two deaths you told us about, Malcolm Jones and Shirley Roberts, there's nothing suspicious about either of them. Mr. Jones was taking medication for a heart condition. It appears he forgot to take his tablets. That seemed strange to me, but I let her go on. And by all accounts, Miss Roberts was inebriated when she left the wake. Those stairs are steep. I don't want to preempt the coroner, but there's nothing to indicate it wasn't an accident.
So, we're looking at the attack on you and Max Lake as an isolated incident, D.I. Snaith said.
But what about Zara Sullivan? Have you tracked her down? Again, they exchanged a glance. You're a writer, aren't you, Mr. Ratcliffe? D.C. Hawkins said. Highly imaginative, always looking for hidden motives and meanings. Well, let me tell you, as someone who deals with reality every day, the simplest explanation for something is almost always the right one. She raised an eyebrow. Exactly. My head was pounding again. I had wanted to talk to them about the strange goings-on at the retreat, but what was the point? They had me marked down as someone who makes shit up, a novelist with an overactive imagination. A nurse came over. I think the patient needs to rest now.
Sure.
The detectives got up, D.I. Snaith grunting as he rose from his plastic seat. D.C. Hawkins studied me for a moment, and I wished I could read her mind, because I was certain there was suspicion in her eyes. We'll talk again, she said, before they walked away. The hospital discharged me the following afternoon. The doctor gave me a self-help sheet listing symptoms I needed to look out for. Drowsiness, poor tolerance of light, feelings of disorientation, confusion. I tried to make a joke about always feeling confused, but the doctor wasn't amused. I didn't want to bother Julia by asking her to pick me up, so I called Ollie Jones. It was a long way for him to come, but I thought he'd appreciate the fare, and it wasn't only that I didn't want to bother Julia. I wanted to talk to Ollie.
Oh, look at you, the walking wounded, he said,
as I approached the taxi and got into the back seat. It was a lovely day, mild and bright, and it was warm inside the cab. For the first time in months I felt the prickle of sweat beneath my armpits.
I heard about what happened, Ollie said, starting the engine. Shocking. Do you have any idea who did it? Who whacked you over the head, I mean?
No.
I bet the police haven't got a bloody clue either, am I right?
Oh, they don't seem to. He turned on the main road.
Shocking to think 2 people, probably 3, have drowned in that same spot in, 2 years.
He swore at a driver who swerved in front of him.
That Lily was a lovely girl, you know.
I hope she's still out there somewhere. I sat forward. You knew her?
Yeah. I live a few doors down from her friends Megan and Jake. I know their mum pretty well.
Of course. Everyone round here knows everyone else.
And my dad was good friends with Wendy's dad. Have you met Wendy? She's lovely. Plus, Megan's a little character, and Jake, well, Wendy does a brilliant job with him, considering his issues.
He paused.
I feel a bit guilty, actually. I told Lily and the others this story about how I'd seen the widow when I was a kid. I was just winding them up, having a laugh, but
I think they believe me. I always picture Lily with this frightened look on her face. I should have told her it was a joke. I tried to get a grip on the conversation. I didn't get a chance to talk to you properly at the funeral. I told you about our dads being friends, didn't I?
Yeah,
he laughed.
Weird to think we might have played together when we were little, before you moved away.
Yeah, I know. So, what happened with your dad? Someone told me he had a heart condition?
Yeah, and the silly fool forgot to take his medicine.
I feigned ignorance. Surely forgetting for, 1 day wouldn't cause you to have a heart attack. I mean, I'm no expert, but...
No, but the doctor told me he must have been under a lot of stress the day he died. And the fact he'd forgotten the medicine didn't help.
God knows what he was stressed about. I mean, he was at home watching TV. I guess he must have been worried about something. I felt bad. The topic was clearly distressing Ollie, but I pressed on anyway. Despite what the police said, I was still convinced Malcolm's death was connected to everything else. Did you see him? The day he died, I mean. Did he seem worried? No, I didn't. He fell quiet. I thought maybe I'd pushed him too far. He was still grieving, the wounds raw. I spoke to him on the phone, though, and he was acting a bit weird. What do you mean? Just, being more emotional than normal. He said something about how he'd let my mum down. It was too late to make amends now. I had no idea what he was going on about. To be honest, I wondered if he'd been drinking, or if it was like the first signs of dementia. He had stopped at a red light. Ollie rubbed his eyes with his fist. Then he said something really odd. He asked me if I would forgive him if he'd done something terrible. The hairs on my arms were standing on end. No, hang on. What he said was, would I forgive him if he'd kept a terrible secret? I asked him what the hell he was talking about, and it was like he chickened out. Started saying it was nothing to worry about, just the ramblings of an old man. His jaw was clenched, and I was worried Ollie was about to start crying. He prevented himself from doing so by changing the subject. You were into books and stuff, aren't you? Of course you are. My dad had thousands of the bloody things, and I've got no idea what to do with them. Maybe you could pop round, take a look and see if there are any you want. Take them off my hands. That's very kind of you, but maybe you should call a dealer. There might be some valuable books among them. Yeah, that's what Heleth said I should do. He shook his head. It's weird. Both our parents dying within a week of each other. What are the odds, eh? She's got the B&B to sort out and isn't sure if she's going to carry on running it. She's talking about selling it and living on the proceeds. I'm trying to persuade her to move in with me. How long have you and Heleth been together? I asked. 20 years. What? I was shocked. He laughed. Including the 18-year break in the middle. We were together for a year when we were young. We got back together last year. I finally wore her down. And neither of you have children? I have, but they live in Cardiff with their mum, my ex-wife. Heleth doesn't have kids, though. She says this isn't a good place to raise children. The whole thing saddened me. It seemed Heleth had stayed here all these years because of Shirley, and now she was threatening to take off and leave Ollie behind. We drove in silence for a few minutes. We weren't far from the retreat now. So, you have no idea what secret your dad was talking about? I asked. He hesitated, just for a second, before saying no. There was clearly something, perhaps buried deep, a doubt or suspicion. I decided not to push it. He would be thinking about it now. Hopefully, it would come to the surface. Maybe I will come to take a look at those books, I said, as we pulled up outside Neath Bran. Cool. He made a telephone sign with his little finger and thumb. Call me, and drove away. Julia was in the kitchen, sitting at the breakfast counter with a cup of tea, surveying the garden. Dark circles ringed her eyes, but the sunlight touched her hair and lit up her face, stopping me in my tracks. It's rude to stare, she said, getting up and coming over. She peered at the bandage on the back of my head. Any bits of brain leak out? She asked. No important bits, I don't think. Still got the part that contains your common sense? Oh, God, no. That withered and died a long time ago. She smiled. Coffee? It's okay. I'll make it. If you're sure. Julia leaned against the counter. As I filled the kettle and placed it on the Arga, she said, The police were here again, asking questions. About what? About you. I turned from the Arga. What kind of questions? She cradled her tea. They wanted to know about your relationship with Max, how you got on. Snaith had a copy of your novel. Sweetmeat? Yeah. He was flicking through it, reading out some of the violent scenes. He asked me if you'd shown any signs of aggression since you'd been here. Of course, Ursula had already told them about the time you threatened Max. Jesus, they can't believe that was a real threat, surely. What, do they think I killed Max and hit myself over the head with a rock and jumped in the river? That's nuts. I don't know what they think, Lucas. At least the reporters have gone. There was a house fire in Wrexham. Several kids trapped. Oh, I can't bear to think about it. They've all gone there. I finished making the coffee, adding 2 sugars. Where's Ursula now? I asked. In her room. She's talking about leaving in the next couple of days. And Susie? Same. Looks like you're going to be my only customer, unless you're planning on buggering off too. I doubt the police would let me go even if I wanted to. But I'm not
Going anywhere? Assuming that's okay with you. She met my eye. Of course. I want you to stay. A wry smile. I doubt I'll get any more customers coming here after what happened. Not that it matters anyway. Maybe the whole thing was a terrible idea. I should start illustrating again. Find work. I've still got contacts. The energy seemed to drain from her body. It feels pointless, all of it. Julia. I got up and crossed the kitchen to where she stood. She looked up at me, eyes brimming with tears. I put my hand out, touched her arm. She stepped closer to me. We were inches apart. The silence so heavy between us, the air as thick as tar. She moved closer still. Time stopped. The world was silent. I touched her cheek and brushed away a tear with my thumb. She rested her forehead against mine. Beyond the window, a bird called out. Sunshine danced across the kitchen. I closed my eyes and waited for our lips to meet. Suddenly, I was holding empty air. I opened my eyes. She was in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself. She was painfully beautiful. I'm sorry, she said, as she left the room. Chapter 33. Drowsiness, poor tolerance of light, feelings of disorientation, confusion. I had the full set, but I didn't think it had anything to do with my head injury. I sat at the desk in my room and tried to figure out what to do next. The police had my laptop, so I couldn't work. I thought about calling D.C. Hawkins and D.I. Snaith and demanding it back, but I didn't want to face more of their questions. If they suspected me, did I need to get a solicitor? Were they going to bring me in for questioning? Nerves chewed at my stomach. I opened my phone and caught up on the news. Max got all the headlines, of course. Apparently, his last book was now #1 on Amazon. It's what he would have wanted. My inbox was flooded with emails from my agent and publisher, both of them telling me if I needed more time to finish the book, that was understandable. Finally, a tiny silver lining, though I felt guilty thinking any positive thoughts. I had lots of emails from readers, too, hoping this wouldn't delay my next novel, and my Facebook page was abuzz with well-wishers. I left a message letting everyone know I was okay, with a link to a page Max's family had set up for donations to a charity in his name. I had a knot in my stomach the size of Hawaii. Half of me was afraid that whoever had tried to kill me, and I was sceptical about Glyn Collins's alibi, would come back. The other half wanted him to appear so I could confront him. I would be prepared this time. I parted the curtains and looked out at the darkening landscape. It was silent out there. Silent and still. The retreat was locked up and secure. No one could get in. I made a list in my aching head of things I needed to do. Go and see Ollie to talk more about his dad, try to persuade the police that I wasn't a fantasist, persuade them to check if Zara's passport had been used, persuade them, too, that I hadn't murdered Max. I was exhausted. I felt it deep in my muscles and in my soul. I went along to the bathroom and ran a bath. The hot water soothed me, and by the time the water started to cool, I was almost asleep. I dragged myself to the bedroom, and still damp, fell naked into bed, into sleep. The door clicked open. Someone was in my room, but unlike before, I had left the curtains parted. By the light of the moon, I could see a silhouette standing by the bed as it appeared to slough off its skin. Something soft hit the floor. The silhouette slipped under my covers. "What?" I began. A finger touched my lips. "Shh." It was Julia. Her mouth met mine, and an arm slipped around me. She was naked, her skin cool and soft. I pulled her closer, feeling how her body trembled, breath quickening as she kissed me harder, silky hair falling over my face, tickling me as she pushed herself up, manoeuvring me onto my back. She lay flat upon me, legs stretched out along mine, breasts pressed against my chest, one hand gripping mine against the sheets, skin against skin, lips against lips. Then she was sitting up, astride me, rocking slowly, palms flat on my chest, hair falling forward as her hips moved back, forth, back, forth. I sat up, kissing her deeply and pulling her against me as she nipped at my lips, raked her fingernails down my back.
She pushed herself harder against me, and I could sense her frustration, the need for an orgasm, and I turned her over, withdrew, and put my head between her legs. I glanced up at her, across the glorious landscape of her flesh, the flush around her collarbone, the increasing rise and fall of her chest, and with my fingers and tongue I made her come. A moment later I was inside her again, and I tried to fight it, to hold back, but she murmured, "It's okay," and I surrendered. A climax like a series of explosions rippling across my entire body. She lay with her head on my chest. We didn't speak. A little while later we started kissing again. We kissed for what felt like hours. It felt like a dream, like being outside myself.